Welcome back. After last week, let's say that we've picked our beat, we've found our story, we've gathered all of our facts, and we've got the perfect article type in mind. Where do we go from there? We've got to actually write this thing. So how do we start? Well, let's start at the very beginning. It's a very good place to start, after all. The best place to start is with the fundamental building blocks of language. That's right. Legos. Now, Legos, much like grammar, are something that most of us learn to play with very early in life, and then most of us don't think of very much later in life. And sometimes it's because we've mastered it and it's become second nature, and sometimes it's because we think it's stuff that we should have learned in third grade and then put away. But writing a good piece is just like building a good city out of Legos. Now, I have two young children, and they're really into Legos at the moment, and it's really fun watching them try and figure these things out. Because when they first start playing with them, they have some blocks and they don't really know what to do with them, but after a while, they start to get the feel of the rules for how these things connect, and they start to be able to be creative with them, and they start to get to know their blocks better and better. And sooner or later, they're able to do some pretty amazing stuff with these things. You see, the more complex the thing you're building, the more you have to pay attention to the specific parts and their functions. So we're going to use these blocks to build some sentences, and we'll discover the rules of grammar together as we go. Now, the shortest and easiest way to construct a complete thought would be with one of these. This may look like a flower, but it is actually an interjection. An interjection is a word like wow. It's a thought, but it has no subject. It has no action, it has no description. It's just sort of a short, to the point, maybe somewhat flowery, decorative piece of language that could sit there all by itself. It's not much of a sentence, but it could do. Wow! What the gee willikers? Gadzooks! You get the point. It's not much, but it makes sense all on its own. So, this could do, but chances are we want to make our sentence a little bit more interesting than just that. And if you're not going to have just something like an interjection, then you need two parts to your sentence. One is a subject, and that is basically where you're going to put all the things who are doing something. What are the things you're talking about in this sentence? And the second part that you'll need is a predicate. And a predicate is what that person or that thing is doing. There we go. Now, this mat was not really made to support predicates, I guess. Let's try and move this over a little bit. There we go. Now, the first thing we might want to ask ourselves is, who are we talking about? What is this sentence going to be about? And so we need a person, place, or thing. Like this noun. Say, John. John's a perfectly good noun to start with. Now, John here is a particular type of noun because he's a noun with a name. It's a proper name because he is what's known as a proper noun. A proper noun is a noun that has a specific name and it gets capitalized. So, the White House gets capitalized. Atlanta, Georgia is a person, place, or thing that has a name and it gets capitalized. If it were just man instead of John, it would not be capitalized because it's not proper. It's a common noun. So nouns can be common or proper. And you can also have nouns that refer to other nouns. We'll talk about them a little bit later, but spoiler alert, they're called pronouns. So John's gonna do something, and you could put this here and say, wow, John! And no one would have any idea what you're talking about. So you probably need something in this predicate, the action that John is doing. So what did John do? John threw. John threw. And this verb is going to connect our subject to our predicate. And this gives John something to do. This is your second fastest way to make a sentence. Subject, predicate, noun, verb. John threw, period. The end. Relatively uninspiring. So let's keep going with this. If you have a verb like threw, it might leave you wondering, like, what did John throw? These are very important verbs called transitive verbs. They're not just verbs you do, they're verbs you do to something. So, John threw something, presumably something like, maybe, a ball. So we'll add another noun here. John threw the ball. Something's missing, isn't it? John threw the ball to whom, you might ask? Well, maybe John threw the ball to Mary. And so Mary's going to be sitting right over here. And we have now John, our subject, threw, our transitive verb. And then the thing that receives that action, the thing that John threw, the ball, is what's known as a direct object. It's the object that's directly receiving the action. In this case, the ball being thrown. What did John throw? The ball. That's the direct object. And then we have to whom or to what that action is being directed. So John threw what? He threw the ball. To whom? To Mary. And that is a special type of noun called an indirect object. So what did John throw? The direct object. To whom? The indirect object. And so we might have a sentence now, wow, John threw ball Mary. Okay, we've got some things missing here. First of all, John threw the ball to Mary, right? We need some word that describes the position of one thing in relation to another. For that, we have these handy little words like to, which are called prepositions. And you can remember that because preposition has the word position in it. A preposition is a block or a word that describes the position of something relative to another, usually in terms of place or time. So words like to, for, at, through, until, before. So John threw the ball to Mary. Just wiped off my to. Much better. Now this is a perfectly serviceable sentence. Wow, John threw the ball to Mary. It's got a subject, it's got a predicate, it's a complete thought, we can stick a period at the end and call it a day. But it's still a rather boring sentence. You might want to describe these things a bit more. Make your nouns and your verbs a little bit fancier. After all, it's not much of a good house if you only build one layer, right? You want to build up on top of this stuff. So you might need some words that can describe, that can modify your nouns, add to your nouns. For example, maybe this ball is not just any ball, but it's a shiny ball. Now, this shiny ball, we'll stick it right on top of this ball. I'll have to move this over a little bit. This shiny ball is now an adjective describing the noun. Shiny describes the ball. Remember, an adjective is any word that describes a noun. And a noun is a person, place, or thing. Now, we still have this one other word that we haven't really talked about, we just kind of glossed over, and that's the word the. Because right now, technically, we've built John threw shiny ball to Mary. But we do have this word the. And the is basically a very fancy type of adjective in a way, because it describes ball. It gives the particular ball you're talking about. And this type of block is called an article. And articles can be definite, meaning you know definitely which ball you're talking about, the ball. Or they can be indefinite, meaning you don't know which ball in particular. It could be any ball, it's just a ball, a ball. So definite articles like the, or indefinite articles like a, modify a noun the same way an adjective would. So we'll build this right on top of here. So now you can see we have, wow, John threw the shiny ball to Mary. So you can build on your nouns and make them fancier. You might also want to build on your verbs and make your verbs a little fancier as well. After all, they don't want to be left out, right? How did John throw it? Did John throw it quickly, or did John throw it haphazardly or carelessly? I think John is a very conscientious individual, and so John probably threw the ball gently. And gently, this pleasant little girl on this block that I randomly stole from my child will tell you, is an adverb. And you can remember that really easily because it adds to the verb. John gently threw the shiny ball to Mary. An adverb modifies a verb, just like how an adjective modifies a noun. Now, that's not the only thing that adverbs can do. In fact, adverbs can modify a verb, as we saw, but adverbs can also modify an adjective, which is modifying a noun. So maybe it's not just a shiny ball, it's a pleasantly shiny ball. So we can build even further on top. Wow. John gently threw the pleasantly shiny ball to Mary. Now we're cooking up a sentence. Now, while we're on the subject of verbs, we're not on the subject of verbs. While we're pretending to be on the subject of verbs, verbs are tricky little creatures. They're very mischievous in that they like to pretend to be other types of speech, just to trick you. They make buildings really complicated and hard to follow the directions for, but they essentially serve the same purposes. They just like to get in on all the action that they can, active little buggers that they are. Get it? Verbs, active, action. So you might have a situation where a verb, this red block, is masquerading as a noun, wearing its blue disguise here. These types of verbs usually are verbs that end in ing, and they end up taking the place of a person, place, or thing. For example, if I said, hiking is my favorite pastime, what's my favorite pastime? My favorite pastime would be a person, place, or thing, right? The thing here is hiking, but to hike is a verb. So it's a verb to hike. When you add ing, hiking can become a noun. These are called gerunds. So right now we're getting into the territory of all those words you've heard and ignored for all those years because who needs to really know what they mean? Well, now you actually will know what they mean. And when you hear the word gerund, you'll know that it's actually just a noun being formed by a verb that's pretending to be a noun, like hiking. Now, these verbs don't want to just take over the role of nouns. No, they don't stop there. They want as much action as they can get. So they might also take over the role of adjectives, like this adjective-shaped red block, very deceptive here, these disguised verbs they are. If I said, the knight in shining armor, you might say, what kind of armor? Well, you're describing the armor, it must be an adjective. But shining, to shine, is a verb. It's a verb. When you add ing once again, it becomes an adjective this time instead of a noun. Sometimes, instead of adding ing, you add ed. For example, the cracked mirror. Cracked, to crack something, is a verb, but putting ed at the end, cracked, makes it describe the mirror, acting like an adjective, describing a noun. These types of verbs are called participles. So if you've ever heard about participles, past participles, participial phrases, participle this, participle that, I know you hear it all the time and it just gets so wearisome, right? If you've ever heard of participles, that's what they're talking about. It's just a verb that's describing a noun, acting like an adjective, like cracked or shining. Now, it doesn't stop there because, of course, they might want to also pretend to be one of these slender little adverbs. A verb describing another verb or describing another adjective. And these take the form of an infinitive. For example, if I said, we ran to escape danger. We ran how? If you're describing how we ran, you're describing a verb. That would be an adverb, right? Except we ran to escape. And escaping is a verb in itself. So it's a verb modifying a verb. It's a verb acting like an adverb. And because it's unconjugated, to escape. Think like if you ever learned Spanish or French or another language. To escape, right? To verb. You put that word in front and it's unconjugated. Like correr, to run. You can then conjugate it to I run, you run, he, she, it runs, they run, we run, so on and so forth. But unconjugated is called the infinitive. So an infinitive can act like an adverb. This would be technically an adverbial infinitive. Now, they can also work as an adjective, an adjectival infinitive, which is basically like, now's the best time to start. It's describing the time, but it's the time to start, which is another verb. We're getting in the weeds a little bit here, but there's three types of infinitives: the adverbial, the adjectival, and the nominal. And you guessed it, if adverbial is pretending to be an adverb, adjectival is pretending to be an adjective, nominal is pretending to be a noun. Nominal, like nominate, nomenclature, naming things, nouns. And that would be like, I like to run. What do I like? A thing. That thing is to run. Run's a verb. Well, it's a verb pretending to be a noun because it's infinitive. And we're back here with these verbs masquerading as other things because of how they're conjugated and how they're used. There's a special name for this sort of verb, and those are simply called verbals. So these verbals can be gerunds, like nouns, with ing, participles, acting like adjectives, with ing or ed, or infinitives, acting like nouns, adjectives, or adverbs, but using to verb in front, the word to, unconjugated. All right, now suppose you have some leftover blocks and you figure you might as well make something with them. So you dig through and you pull out, another subject and another predicate we'll probably do. Let's stick these on here. So we've got a subject, we've got another predicate here, and here's a blue block, and here's a, okay, so this blue block could be she. Maybe we're referring to Mary. She. And then what was she doing? Maybe she was thrilled. Maybe we want to do something like that. So she was thrilled. And there's a perfectly good thought. Subject, verb, predicate. Got everything that we need. Now you'll notice a few things right off the bat, I hope. The first of which is that we decided to use not Mary's name, but this other type of noun that stands for Mary. She. It's a word that refers to a noun, and this is called a pronoun. He, she, it, they. We don't know exactly what one they're talking about unless we've referred to it already. So she refers back to Mary in this case. The second thing you'll notice is that we decided to use the red adjective here, our verbal adjective, or as we now know, participle. And that's because it is thrilled. We're describing something as being thrilled, but thrill is a verb with ed, right? So it is a verb pretending to be an adjective. So we've got our participle block here. Now the third thing you might notice is that before, when we used an adjective, it was built on top of the word that it was describing. The shiny ball. But what is thrilled describing? It's not sitting on anything other than just the floor here. Thrilled is actually describing her, describing she. And so how does that work? We've got a thing in the predicate describing something in the subject, and it's not even built on top of it. It doesn't actually describe anything in the predicate at all. The same would go for sentences like, the ball is red. Red doesn't describe anything in the predicate. It describes the ball. Or if I said Biden is president, the noun president isn't a direct object or an indirect object. We didn't throw the president, or we didn't throw a ball to the president. So what's it doing? What's this noun doing in the predicate? Well, it turns out it's actually describing something earlier. President is describing Biden. So these all are words in the predicate that describe the subject. It's as if you could replace the whole sentence with the phrase the red ball rather than the ball is red, or President Biden rather than Biden is the president. This is another odd feature of verbs, particular verbs called linking verbs. Now you'll notice that I built this verb a little bit differently because it is a verb here that reaches out and links the predicate back to the subject. A linking verb, most commonly the verb to be, as in is or was, takes the words that are in the predicate and makes them describe the subject. That makes this very complicated to describe, but simple in principle. The linking verb makes this adjective, which we've now discovered is a participle, it actually makes this called a predicate adjective because it's a piece in the predicate that describes the subject. Now, when we had the sentence Biden is president, the noun that's in the predicate that describes the subject, it would be called a predicate nominative. Again, that nominal nomenclature, naming noun. Anytime you hear the word nominal, that's nouns. So we can have a linking verb linking a predicate adjective or a predicate nominative to describe the subject, even though it's not sitting in the subject. Hope you're tracking with this. It's a little confusing perhaps, but we'll get there. Now, each of these buildings can get more and more complex, and you start to see clusters of these bricks that, as a unit, act like one of these parts of speech. For example, the pleasantly shiny ball, as a whole, these cluster of blocks right here, this works as a complete set here. It's almost like this whole chunk is a noun. What is it? It's a pleasantly shiny ball. This cluster is called a phrase. And so we're going to talk a little bit about phrases, and phrases can be quite confusing. So I've drawn up a little diagram for you here, and we can go through this together. Phrases are tricky to identify because they nest and overlap, and when you're trying to describe a cluster of words, you can describe them in terms of what kind of words make them up, or you can describe them in terms of what those cluster of words are trying to act like. So this could be a cluster full of adjectives, but it might be acting like a noun. So do you call it an adjective cluster, an adjective phrase, or do you call it a noun phrase? This is why it gets a little bit confusing, and things can actually be called by multiple names. So take a look at this. So here I've broken down all the different phrases that you might encounter in a way that is hopefully slightly less complicated at least. You can have phrases of words, groups of words that act like a noun. A noun phrase. For example, the crazy old lady in the park feeds the pigeons every day. The crazy old lady in the park is a group of words that could just be one noun. If I just said Bob, that would also be a noun. Bob feeds pigeons every day. That totally makes sense. So the crazy old lady in the park is grammatically no different than Bob. It's just a big old complicated noun. A noun phrase. You could also have a phrase that acts like an adverb, something that describes an action. She runs very quickly. She runs how? She runs very quickly. A group of adverbs or prepositional phrase that modifies the verb. Now here's where it gets a little complicated because remember we said we could describe them by how they're functioning or by the things that make them up. And so your noun phrase might also be called an appositive phrase if the noun phrase is made up of these words that are called an appositive. For example, Bob, my best friend, is coming to dinner. It renames a noun. It's not technically modifying it, but it's giving it a different characteristic. So Bob, comma, my best friend, comma, is coming to dinner. these my best friend cluster of words functions as a noun. So it's a noun phrase, but it's a specific type of noun phrase known as an appositive phrase. It could also be a gerund phrase. Remember we said gerunds are verbs that act like nouns. You could have a cluster of these things. So I love baking cakes. Baking is a gerund. I love what? I love baking. I love baking cakes. So that is a phrase using a gerund. But it acts like a noun. So you could call it a gerund phrase, or you could also call it a noun phrase. Same with infinitive. I love to bake cakes. It uses an infinitive, so you could call it an infinitive phrase, but it functions like a noun, so you could call it a noun phrase. Same goes for prepositions. Prepositional phrases, the food on the table looks amazing. Those could function as nouns, or adverbs, or adjectives, depending on what types of prepositions you're using. So you can see why these are all connected. So adverbial phrases are any group of words that act like adverbs. She runs very quickly. It's a group of adverbs, or a prepositional phrase, that modifies a verb. You could have adjectival phrases. The box is full of toys. This is a group of adjectives, or a phrase, like a prepositional phrase, that modifies a noun, acts like an adjective. Another type of adjective phrase, or adverbial phrase, might be a participial phrase. So instead of using a preposition, where it says the food on the table, where, on, showing the position, so there's a preposition. So the phrase is using prepositions, so it's a prepositional phrase, but it's acting like an adverb or acting like an adjective. So it could be an adverbial phrase or an adjectival phrase. Confused yet? Anyway, you could also have a participial phrase, so it's using participles. Crushed by the hammer, the computer no longer worked. Any phrase beginning with a past present participle, ed or ing, that acts like an adjective or adverb. So it could act like an adverbial phrase or an adjectival phrase. So you can see how these overlap. Then we have verb phrases, which are fairly simple enough. It's a bunch of words that describe an action, that are an action. I had been watching TV at the time. Had been watching is the verb. It's basically a complicated conjugating of a verb. A group of verbs acting as one action, the entire predicate technically could be a verb phrase. And lastly, you might find an absolute phrase. And an absolute phrase is actually an entire clause that has no verb, and it's stuck onto another phrase or another clause. For example, my cake baking in the oven, I was finally free to go rest. My cake baking in the oven is actually a clause that's missing the verb is, right? My cake is baking in the oven. You could have said, my cake was baking in the oven, period. I was finally free to go rest. But because you wanted to link them together, you said, my cake baking in the oven, I was finally free to go rest. This was an absolute phrase. So you can see it might get a little bit confusing, but if you just think in terms of what are the words that make this up, or how is this whole thing functioning, then you'll know what to call it. If it's made of participles, it's a participial phrase. If those participles are acting like an adverb, then you could also call it an adverbial phrase, and so forth. Now, this is usually the point which most students have tuned out long ago and stopped trying to understand any of this. But phrases are important, if nothing else, simply for resolving all of those questions about things like commas. When you flip open to Strunk and White and you try and figure out where your comma should go, and it says something like, add a comma after an introductory participial phrase, you basically have no choice but to ignore that rule if you don't know what a participle is, and if you don't know what a participial phrase is, a phrase acting like a participle, acting like an adjective, right? But if you know what those things mean, then it's really easy to figure out where that comma goes. Dodging arrows left and right, the hunter escaped danger. I know now that I should put that comma after dodging arrows left and right, after that introductory participial phrase. And we call it participial phrase because that word dodging is actually a verb, but it's describing how the hunter escaped. So dodging arrows left and right. Or when you have another rule like use no comma when the last adjective before a noun outranks its predecessors because it is an integral element of a noun phrase, which is the equivalent of a single noun. Well, who knows what that means unless you know what a noun phrase is. You know it's a whole bunch of blocks, a cluster of blocks that act like a noun. For something like the red hot rod. Now, if you don't know what a noun phrase is, you might not know whether to put the comma between red and hot, as if you're describing a single rod as being both red or hot, or if you don't put a comma because it's all one noun phrase. It's a red hot rod. Now then, we've got all these bricks, we've got all these words, and if each of these bricks is like a word, then a complete thought is kind of like a room in a building. Maybe this is a room, and this is a room, and maybe these clusters are kind of like furniture. Let's put a nice TV stand here, the pleasantly shiny ball TV stand. They make sense as a unit, but they don't have any context. They don't make a whole room, so you have to stick it into a room, like a predicate or a subject, with all of the accompanying pieces, and it builds up a full thought. And then phrases are not full thoughts because they lack a predicate or a subject. They have to become part of a predicate or a subject in order to be a full thought. When you have a cluster of blocks that does have a subject, it does have a predicate, it's a complete thought, such as John gently threw the pleasantly shiny ball to Mary. That is a whole room, and that is what we call a clause. It's a discrete, fully furnished piece of building here that works all on its own. So we've got two clauses here. We've got John gently threw the pleasantly shiny ball to Mary, and we've got the second clause, she was thrilled. Now there are two types of clauses. Right now, both of these are what we call independent clauses. They're independent. They can stand on their own. They don't need any help from anybody. But what if we wanted to connect these two together with something like this word, and? So here we've got to make some room here, pardon me. Now we've got one clause that definitely depends on the other. The clause, and she was thrilled. If we didn't have that first clause about John throwing the ball, we wouldn't know what this is referring to. And she was thrilled depends on the independent clause. And so that's the second type. We've got the independent clause, and then the second type of clause of full thought, of full room, is a dependent clause, sometimes called a subordinate clause. It's a whole room, but it's not a whole building. It's kind of like the other room in a suite, and it depends on your room here in order to make sense. So if you connected these together with this word called and, you would be using this white block, and this white block is known as a conjunction. Conjunction, junction, what's your function? Okay, am I dating myself? All right. Conjunctions are words that conjoin two clauses. For example, and, because, but, so. These are the pieces that stick two pieces together. And now we've got one whole building here. And this is essentially a really good sentence. Wow, John gently threw the pleasantly shiny ball to Mary and she was thrilled. It's a very exciting game of catch. So now the next task is essentially to put a whole bunch of these buildings together until you have a housing development, until you have a neighborhood, until your sentences are paired with other sentences to build a paragraph. And then you build more paragraphs together, more neighborhoods together until you have a city, a town. And then you can build more of those towns together until you have an essay, like a state. And then you could build these essays together until you have a full published work, a book or a dissertation, and you're building the entire world sooner or later. So next time you're playing with Legos, I apologize because this is what you'll be thinking of. But I encourage you to think about your grammar in this way as far as getting to know the essential building blocks and how they can make up a sentence. By the way, if I asked you if any of you have ever diagrammed a sentence, done sentence diagramming, maybe one or two of you, a small handful of you, would raise your hand. But in actuality, sentence diagramming is just a way of visually mapping out how these building blocks go together. And it turns out that sentence diagramming is exactly what you just did now, if we just turned it a little bit. Hopefully that doesn't happen to your actual sentence diagram. So you can see that the sentence diagram actually looks quite a bit like what we just built. Coincidence? I think not. So go ahead and move on to the next module in this week's content, and we'll take a look at how to put some really cool cities together by putting phrases and sentences and clauses together in ways that make sense journalistically. I'll see you there.